Welcome to Reclaiming the Faith with Phil Baker, a podcast with a mission to reveal what the earliest Christians believed about the core issues facing us today. You can find links to all of Phil's resources at philsbaker.com. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen today, and take a moment to share this podcast with your friends. Now, here's Phil.
Hey everybody, this is episode 112. It's another interview with Dr. Judd Burton. This time we're going to be looking at the subject of sacred geography. And Dr. Burton will also be telling us about his new book on Göbekli Tepe and how it relates to the issue of sacred geography as well. Please take some time and go visit Dr. Burton's websites, burtonbeyond.com and tioba.org. I'm blessed to be a part of Omega Frequency, so please go check out everything that BDK does on the two YouTube channels, Omega Frequency and Omega Frequency Live, to find our content that we're putting out every week. Also, I just released my new 5-song EP called Genesis. Please go check that out. You can find that on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, anywhere you can purchase or stream digital music. Go check it out. Also, my book, Faithful Witness, should be out by the end of the month, at the very latest, early November, but it should be late October. So please be ready for that. And thank you so much for your prayers and support. All right. Well, without any further ado, let's get into episode 112, my interview on sacred geography with Dr. Judd Burton. Dr. Judd Burton, thank you again for being on Reclaiming the Faith, man. I think it's like the fourth time, man. I'm just so thankful that you're willing to do this with me.
My pleasure. Happy to.
Yeah, brother. Well, we're going to be talking about sacred geography today, and some about your book that you have coming out on Göbekli Tepe. So, how would you define sacred geography?
Sacred geography is sanctified territory, basically sanctified land. Sometimes the terms sacred space and sacred geography are used interchangeably, but there's some authority placed over the territory, either rendered by some deity in the minds of the people who are using the sacred space or sacred geography, or a combination of the practice of rituals taking place within a given territory or a given space. That, in essence, is sacred geography.
Okay.
Now, it can actually be, technically sacred geography, in most scholarly discussions of sacred geography, you're talking about terra firma, so it's on the earth. But technically, sacred geography could also include, extra-dimensional, heavenly locations as well. Yeah,
that's cool. So how did sacred geography play a role in the Old Testament?
Well, it played a key role. Imagine reading the Old Testament without any of the geographical references. Essentially, everywhere you turn, depending on what part of the ancient Near East or the Mediterranean world you were in, it was all sacred space to somebody. Now, the obvious marker for students of the Bible would be the sacred geography of Israel itself. But, again, Egypt to the Egyptians was sacred space. Its temples were sacred space and sacred geography. The same can be said of people in Mesopotamia and Anatolia and other parts of the Levant. sacred geography for different reasons, because their sacralities were different. Um, so but because the farther back in history you go, people more people per capita typically subscribe to a supernatural worldview. In fact, not having a supernatural worldview was anomalous in the ancient world. These were people who believed that the gods interacted directly with them, and in the case of Israel, that Yahweh interacted directly with them. And so you really can't get through the Old Testament without references to sacred geography. The very boundaries of the Holy Land, the land promised to the Hebrews, constitute the perimeter of a sacred geography, the entire nation. And of course, the city of Jerusalem became a fixture in terms of sacred geography for the Israelites, as did a number of other locations where shrines and monuments and altars and things like that were erected as a testament to Yahweh and his interaction with the people of Israel. And so you're hard pressed to get through the Old Testament without running into examples of sacred geography.
Yeah. So what is Göbekli Tepe, and how is it an example of sacred geography?
Well, Göbekli Tepe is a site in eastern Turkey, southeastern Turkey, and it dates back to the late Mesolithic, early Neolithic period. The conventional dating is about 10,500 BC, and is considered to be the oldest temple in the world, because it's the oldest example we have thus far of the transition between animism or totemism, the reverence of animal spirits, and the conceptualization that their gods were anthropomorphic, that they were human-like. Because some of the like the T-shaped pillars and the circular enclosures are anthropomorphic. They actually have, they and the other pillars actually have anthropomorphic features. Arms that are carved on the sides, and fingers, in front, hands in front of them. So they're clearly depicting something in human-like form. And this sort of the externalization was already there, but this concept seems to be changing for some people in the Neolithic, and the earliest evidence we have now is at Göbekli Tepe, and it seems to be a kind of paradigm breaker in a number of ways, because for the longest time, historians and archaeologists and anthropologists thought that agriculture had to be the bedrock for civilization. But the whole reason that Göbekli Tepe is built is for religious purposes. The agriculture, the cultivation of wheat, is epiphenomenal of the building of Göbekli Tepe. So that comes along in its wake. So just by definition, at its foundations, Göbekli Tepe is sacred geography. It's sacred space. If we're to follow the kind of traditional definition of sacred geography, it's the sculpting of a corner of the religious consciousness of these people, because this event that happens in their lives that prompts them to change trajectory in terms of who they're worshiping and why they're worshiping them. Because religion is so foundational, Göbekli Tepe is it's a religious capital for that region in a lot of ways, because it was drawing people from in some cases quite far away. So you've got people from the Levant who are building there. You got people from all over the Anatolian Peninsula. You're likely drawing in people from the Near East and the Transcaucasus. So it's, something happened that prompted these people to do this, and this whole area became impacted by the sacred geography of Göbekli Tepe, because there are sites around it like Novali Chari and Şanlıurfa that display levels of art and architecture reminiscent of Göbekli Tepe. There are animal carvings there, but they're all there aren't any prey animals. They're all predators. Leopards and let's see, vultures and scorpions and adders and things like that are sort of peppered all throughout the temple complex itself, and those actually are sculptuary. They're not just bas relief. They're actual sculptures that have been sculpted onto the areas of the site that are in other words, that whoever the artisan was is scraping away this workable rock, which is a kind of limestone, in order to make these protrusions, which are animals.
Do you think the choice of predatorial animals is signifying some type of malevolent religious leaning?
It's possible. I've considered that in the past, because these people are hunter-gatherers. Perhaps there's just more work that needs to be done. Quite frankly, it's an immense site, and there's only been, even with the very worthwhile and valuable work that Klaus Schmidt and other archaeologists have done at the site. It's 300 square meters. It's immense. I doubt that they've excavated a 20th of the site. So more work needs to be done. We know that there are many, in fact, probably dozens of more circular enclosures under the ground, just from the imaging, just from ground penetrating radar and magnetometer sweeps.
Wow.
So
why is the discovery of Göbekli Tepe important for 21st century believers?
Well, the scholars that subscribe to a strictly naturalist perspective on Göbekli Tepe would say that there's not much beyond this marks a significant cultural transition in the trajectory of human societies. And that's true. That's a valid observance. But for believers, people need to consider just how significant of a change Göbekli Tepe is, because virtually all humans before that were hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists of some type. That kind of significant change that impacts culture, that impacts ideation, every facet of every institution of a society's culture is irrevocably changed. And now, if you look at examples of this in human history, the only time that happens, that kind of change happens, is when a society is acted upon by a vastly superior, technologically superior culture. And although I don't agree with everything that he proposes, I think that Jared Diamond makes some pretty salient points in Guns, Germs, and Steel, and I think that it's an apt analogy, and I think it explains. And it explains a lot about the identity of the things that were actually causing the change to happen at Göbekli Tepe, and to my mind, those are the Watchers. When Diamond talks about the clash between the old world and the new world in the age of exploration, specifically the Spanish conquest of the Incan Empire, the big clash between Francisco Pizarro and Atahualpa. So what set the Spanish up to be so vastly technologically superior? It's not that they were braver or better people than the Inca, but there were thousands of years behind them of cultural development that had to do with geography, that had to do with epidemiology, it had to do with the development of technologies, that date back, to the Neolithic in many cases, and continued throughout the historical period. And the geographical argument is interesting because the continent of Eurasia is long east to west, which meant that when animal husbandry and farming and metallurgy and things like that developed, they didn't have a lot of climatic or geographical barriers to go past. So they spread relatively quickly. There were also, on the animal husbandry end, herd animals were kept by numerous Eurasian peoples. And in doing so, and being in such close proximity to them, they're inoculated basically generationally by being around them, working with them. So things like anthrax and smallpox, things that start in bovine populations, for instance, they developed antibodies for. And so, if you look at the Americas, they're long north to south. And so when civilization sprouted up in Mesoamerica, or farming or technology or whatever, it had basically every geographical and climatic obstacle that the world had to offer, because all the various climates and geographical features, mountain ranges, rivers, and snow and desert, everything else you can imagine. So the spread was slower. So that by the time that Pizarro and Atahualpa clash, there's not much of a contest. And it had nothing to do, not exclusively, didn't have anything to do exclusively with the generation at that time, because thousands of years of geographical, epidemiological, technological preparation had set the Spanish up to win. And there's a kind of unconscious biological warfare that's going on because none of the peoples in the Americas kept herd animals at the time. So, smallpox was especially virulent. So these cultures that are impacted like this are generally never the same, and often not for the better. I think that's probably the best analogy that we can use to understand what happens at Göbekli Tepe. You have this significant cultural change brought upon by for all intents and purposes, a technologically superior race from another dimension, because there was nobody on the earth at the time who could prompt that sort of change. I mean, an argument could possibly be made for the religious end of it, but even once you begin to take it apart, even that has the mark of the Watchers, so to speak. But this irrevocable change that happens can only happen because of the influence of some outside force. And I think the only culprit at this time were the the quote unquote elder gods of the prehistoric world, and that would be the Watchers.
Yeah, which is written about in First Enoch. And it's making me think that similarly in the Book of Enoch, it says it's for a latter generation. Perhaps the discovery of Göbekli Tepe is also meant, from God's point of view, to prepare us as well, because it seems like history repeats itself, and so potentially that kind of a thing is coming back again, an assault on God and His people.
Yeah, that's a definite possibility. I mean, I tend to agree that the timing of its discovery is suspect, in terms of the prophetic clock, in the same way that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, preceded the establishment of the state of Israel.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the state of Israel, can you explain the importance of, quote, the land, unquote, in Judeo-Christian faith tradition? And do you think there is a theology of the land? If so, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I would say that there is a theology of the land, because you can't separate. For believers, you can't separate the story of salvation and its origins from geography, and you certainly can't separate the story of God's unfolding plan with the Hebrews from geography. So they're integrally linked. Like I said, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, try making any historical or theological sense of the book without the geographical references. You won't get very far. It'll be a truncated philosophy at best. But the purpose, the drive, the direction of God's plan is properly contextualized with geography in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So yeah, I think, again, reiterating what I said earlier, you can't really understand the narrative of the Bible, much less its historicity or theology, without these geographical connections.
Yeah, you were mentioning Jerusalem earlier in the South, and it seems like, and this is probably a pretty weak analogy, but it seems like there's this civil war kind of being set up in the North. You have Dan, the apostate tribe, with Bashan and the Serpent Mound, Gilgal, Rephaim, against the southern area where the Messiah comes from. I was thinking about Dan and its possible connection to the Antichrist, because like Hippolytus writes his treatise on Christ and Antichrist, and he shows so many comparisons and contrasts with Christ and the Antichrist, how the Antichrist is going to try to appear to be the Christ, but he doesn't have the Antichrist coming out of Judah, he has it coming out of Dan. And he's using Old Testament passages to kind of back that up, like Genesis 49, talking about Dan being a viper. Deuteronomy 33, talking about Dan being a lion's whelp. So I was just curious, do you think that there is perhaps a possibility that maybe half of the Antichrist's lineage would come from Dan in the North?
That's an interesting proposal. Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, considering everything associated with Dan and the they're forever marked by their actions. Probably the story that most people would be familiar with would be Micah's idol story that sort of brings the mark of shame on to Dan. But yeah, it's entirely possible. There are a number of theories. Some of them tenable, most of them not, about the tribes of Dan uh, leaving and being, becoming other peoples.
Yeah. In ships
Like
traveling around.
the Danoi are mentioned in Greek literature.
Mm-hmm.
The the name of the Irish
Yeah.
or Celtic lower gods was the Tuatha De Danann, or you can see Dan in there, Danu.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's possible. I mean, it's definitely a possible scenario. Yeah.
Well, cool. So moving to the New Testament, what are some examples of sacred geography that we see in the New Testament?
Well, Judea is an occupied territory at this time. If we're just within the purview of the Gospels, but all of those, or I should say, many of those Old Testament sacred geographical locations and significances are apt and pertinent for the New Testament narrative as well. But in Israel, you have a kind of how would you say, a kind of invasive sacred geography. And this was problematic in the Old Testament too, with influence from all of Israel's neighbors. The Moabites, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, all the other tribes of people that lived in the Levant and practiced a type of paganism. But in the New Testament, that's almost all in the purview of the Greco-Roman world. So in the case of Judea, you've got the Greek and Roman gods that have been introduced by the Hellenistic Greeks first, and then the Romans. So you definitely have some pagan sacred geography overlaid with the traditional sacred geography of the Israelites, and that becomes, because Israel is an occupied territory at the time, those instances of sacred geography, those locations, become even more cherished for the people at the time. Now, as Christianity begins to spread and move out into the Mediterranean basin and other parts of the ancient world, following that, with the establishment of communities of believers, churches, inevitably they're creating sacred space, not only on a local level but also on an international level. So the church buildings eventually get built in some cases, although a lot of people are meeting in houses and basically wherever they can do so safely. So you're creating sacred geography on multiple levels. At the same time, you're running into the sacred geography of the Greco-Roman pagan traditions. And so there's a kind of battle of sacred geographies that's taking place both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament.
Yeah, that was making me think of Acts 16 with the girl with the python spirit that's connected to the Oracle at Delphi.
And Oracle at Delphi, that's right.
Yeah, and then with Ephesus, how so many people are renouncing, their paganism and burning books and all that, and you have that temple of Artemis there, and the people are really scared that Christianity is about to annihilate, this worship of Diana, basically nullify it. So I don't know, that's cool. So this is a question from a buddy of mine, and it kind of blends Old Testament and New Testament together. But he says, I wondered why the fallen angels specifically chose Mount Hermon and why God chose Mount Sinai. When the Watchers came down, they originally were to teach mankind the ways and laws of God, but abandoned those instructions, instead taught them forbidden knowledge. And he's pulling from some patristics there. God gave mankind those instructions himself later, but chose Mount Sinai instead. Why? I'm also interested if Dr. Burton has any idea where Eden is and if it plays into Bible prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So why is God choosing Mount
Well,
Sinai instead of Hermon or, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, traditionally, Hermon had been a boundary marker, one of the northern boundary markers, and you can really kind of think of, particularly because I don't believe that Mount Sinai was in the Sinai Peninsula. I think that southwestern Arabia is probably a better fit. But I mean, you're essentially looking at the northern and southern boundaries of the Promised Land. So, in order to carry out their altered plan, I think the Watchers picked the northern location so that they could fan out into this area. Now, angels aren't all-knowing,
right?
But they're highly intelligent. So they discerned, once they became part of the satanic coup, if you want to look at it in terms of extra-dimensional geopolitics, once they became part of that plan, they knew that they were going to have to end up in a place, or the place rather, that the Messiah was going to spring from. They didn't know exactly where that was, but they had a general idea. So I think that that's one explanation as to why they ended up in Mount Hermon and the traditions that built up around it. It's also worth noting, as a footnote to that the cardinal directions represent different things in terms of sacred geography to the Israelites. And north was the direction of evil. This was the place where Baal had his abodes. Mount Zaphon was to the north, actually not terribly far from Mount Hermon. So these seem to be the you can think of these two mountains as the polar opposites of the religious consciousness of the ancient Israelites. With Yahweh taking the southern end, that too I think is significant, because these mountains in general, okay, in religious studies are thought of as these connections between the celestial and the mundane, the earthly and the heavenly. And they were, in religious consciousness all over the world, they were considered to be and are considered to be natural features, but they jut up into the sky. They go into the realm of the gods, and so they represented these points of connectivity between these two worlds. And I think that that's very much, it's something that I've written about in my work on Peneus and Mount Hermon. I think that's very much at play there for different reasons. One nefarious, one salvific. And so you could kind of think of those two mountains in that context. Now, as to the location of Eden, I still firmly believe that Eden was in eastern Turkey. We have two of the geographical markers, even if their direction was somewhat different. The direction of the flow of the rivers is somewhat different in the pre-flood world. We have to remember that Moses is being shown a vision of all this, and he's using stuff as best he can, things that he recognizes, to describe this vision of prehistory, in much the same way that John is being shown the end of time. Moses is being shown the beginning of time. Now, Eden was a country that had a garden in it that began the redemptive line for humanity, the line of the Messiah. But I think the case can be made for an Eastern Turkey location. That entire region is significant, in fact, because of its proximity to Göbekli Tepe. It's associated with Noah because the Ark comes to rest in the mountains of Ararat. This is a region of the ancient Near East that's also significant for Abraham. Abraham's home of Haran is in this region. We have those geographical markers in the Old Testament, and that's why Shanlurfa is actually a better candidate for Abraham's Ur than Ur in Iraq. And in fact, that's the local tradition that's existed for centuries, that Shanlurfa is actually Abraham's Ur. It makes sense because there's so many references back to this. This is where he sends his servant to get a wife for his son. He's tied to the land. So there's lots of biblical significance to that part of Turkey as to Eden and what it has to do with prophecy. If you read biblical prophecy, and specifically Revelation, it's about, in many ways, it's about restoring paradise. It's about restoring Eden. And so that's got to be part of the prophetic equation, if you will, in any discussion about the Garden of Eden, its location, and what its significance may have. Now, I'm also of the mind that the Watchers chose this location to make an outpost, which I think is what Göbekli Tepe was, in addition to a temple. It's kind of supernatural outpost. They didn't know exactly where the Garden of Eden was. It was under guard, of course, by an angel. My surmise is that, almost in a kind of Tower of Babel sort of way, they hoped to weaponize Eden, convince the angel to side with them that guarded the place, or they thought that they could overpower him and enter Eden, because it was this weird place where the earthly dimension touched the heavenly dimension. Adam and Eve were right there, had direct access to God. They could talk to him anytime they wanted to. So I think that they wanted to weaponize that in some way in the retaking of heaven, which is a scenario that plays out in the Tower of Babel story.
Do you think that could be the reason for that is to get to the tree of life, or the angels that are rebelling against God?
Say that again.
So kind of like Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, so they couldn't get back to the tree of life, in one sense. That sin bringing death. And this is something that Al Barino was talking about on the Blurry Creatures podcast recently. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on it. Like he's of the opinion that these fallen angels, the Watchers that sinned, are also dying. And so their attempt they're trying to get back to the tree of life somehow. And so, like, my question is, like, do you think them setting up that outpost next to where they believe the Garden of Eden is to try to get in there so that they can have immortality, in a sense?
Well, I had never really considered that. I personally don't, and I haven't listened to Tim's argument. He may have some valid points, but I personally have not run across anything that would convince me that they weren't eternal beings. Yeah. Because I mean, even in their state now, they don't, their livelihood, their biology, whatever you want to call it, is it's not native to this place.
Yeah.
So I for the time being, that's not something that I subscribe to, that they're actually dying. the I mean, if we're to believe Scripture, they're going to be in a perpetual state of death after judgment. It'll be a living death.
Right.
They won't be able to escape the punishment that's coming.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'd have to go back and listen to that. But as it stands now, I don't really subscribe to that.
Cool. Well, continuing to think about prophetic things, future things, how do you believe sacred geography will play a role in the future?
Well, I mean, there's not a time that it doesn't play a role. There's that, and I don't mean that flippantly.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that you can think about it really as kind of competing sacred geographies. You know, with believers on the one hand, and people that oppose believers on the other, or are indifferent. We also have to remember that Paul gives us a really good taxonomy of the kind of entities. And at this point, he's not telling his audience anything that they don't know, because this is Old Testament stuff. These entities that control these geographical realms. That God had set them over the nations. That's a sacred geography in and unto itself, because it's not only celestial in nature, but it's also earthly, because you actually have geographical regions of the earth that are not policed, but ruled by these things. And so it's, in many ways, it's competing sacred geographies constantly.
Yeah. So in John 2, Jesus calls himself the Naos of God, like bringing in that term about either the Holy of Holies or the holy place. And Paul uses the same term when referring to Christians in a plural form in 1 Corinthians 3, and then a singular form in 1 Corinthians 6. So do you think that the Antichrist's coming abomination of desolation could include more than just the defilement of a building known as God's temple? Like, because Jesus is saying, yeah, there's the holy place, but I'm the holy place. And so, like, the Antichrist setting himself in God's temple, do you think that he's trying to maybe pull a similar thing, like putting himself inside people in a weird way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a sort of, I like the way that Doug Camp talks about that sort of thing in his books. The Corrupting the Image series is really good. I don't know if you've taken a look at that, but in it he argues a kind of similar. Yeah, he argues a kind of similar. There's a similar logic in what he's proposing.
Okay.
That this illustration, that Jesus is using is apt. And for that matter is also, when it comes to people, when it comes to humans, they become the battlegrounds in a lot of ways for these competing sacred geographies.
Right.
So, those are also great examples of, how you can't get very far historically or theologically in the text of the Bible without having to deal with sacred geography, much less physical or political geography. Now Jesus is using, the body as a portion of that, to me, which goes back to reflects the connection that the Israelites had with the land that was apportioned to them.
Well, last main question. This is just kind of coming to my head. I believe the late David Flynn made a case for the like foundational stone of the earth being in Jerusalem, where the Ark of the Covenant would be laid or whatever. And so, like, do you think? What do you think is the reason for Jerusalem being like the ultimate place of showdown between Christ and Antichrist?
Well, David Flynn was on a whole other level compared to the rest.
Sure.
He was quite insightful. I still refer to a lot of his work. But as to why Jerusalem became the showdown, the explanation is really simple. It's because God designated it as the capital for the nation of Israel, and it's really just that simple. Now, as to the foundation stone actually coming from Jerusalem, I'd have to go back and look at Flynn's work, but that just adds another layer of substantiation, basically, to why it would be. But when you consider so much of the narrative of the Bible, the drama of the Bible is taking place in this location. It's the ultimate battleground. I mean, it's the final battleground, right? I mean, it's the most trampled on, fought over, stretch of territory on the planet in many ways. Not just in terms of the armies of men, but also in terms of supernatural armies. The good versus evil, cosmic order, Star Wars kind of stuff. Again, not to be flippant, but to kind of put it in perspective, that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
This part of the world was ground zero for the first stages, really, of the execution of Satan's plan against the Messiah, to destroy, to either corrupt or completely destroy the bloodline, which of course he failed at doing. But I think that there are significant things happening in Jerusalem that are sort of moving forward the prophetic clock, as it were. The movement of the American embassy from Tel Aviv was pretty significant, but there are also other things going on, like they've identified the line of red heifer necessary for the sacrifices. The name of the organization escapes me, but all the materials and plans and heavy equipment for building the temple are ready to go at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
Basically, whenever that happens. And so even in our own time, we can sort of discern the urgency that's embodied in the sacred geography of Israel and Jerusalem, especially.
Do you feel comfortable giving a hypothesis as to why God chose that specific area? I mean, I know that goes back to, it seems like it goes back to Abraham and Isaac, go to the mountain, I'll show you, and it's right there.
Right.
But as to why he would have chosen that, do you feel comfortable offering a hypothesis on that?
Well, I mean, it's the beginning of the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, right? Not the that's actually, though, that's where we find the sort of first illustration of the sacrifice that Jesus would eventually make, which he does make in Jerusalem. So right there, those are two very big anchor points, if you will, for why God chose this place, why it's so significant in the past, why it'll be so significant as a battleground in the future, because it's always been a battleground. So there's my very terse hypothesis as to why Jerusalem is so significant in the sacred geography of Israel.
Well, thanks, man. What are some final words of encouragement or advice you'd like to give our listeners, and also where can they find all of your awesome work?
Well, I always offer the encouragement of salvation. That's the chiefest of joys that you can derive in this life. And we live in kind of scary times right now for a number of reasons, but we have to remember, where our faith, as believers, we have to remember where our faith lies. And so we do kingdom work, until we're called home. And it's never too late in terms of prophecy. God always allows for a reprieve. If people repent and turn back to God, if we can do that on a society level here in the States, there's hope. There's always hope. Even if it doesn't come in that form, there's always going to be some sort of, we have a hope that transcends and goes beyond the mundane, even on this planet. If people want to follow me, they can check out my websites, burtonbeyond.com and tioba.org. I'm on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. I'm starting to get more platforms like Gab, and going to be moving some stuff over to Rumble, so that I can bypass any sort of undue censorship. I haven't had to deal with any of it yet, but how long that's going to last, we'll see. People can order my books through the site. I also have a author page at lulu.com where people can get the books, and I'm in the process of moving stuff over to Amazon, so it won't be too long before they can do that. I've got a special this week on coursework. People can get all the each certification's on sale for $110. So that's a 12-course module. So if you're interested in sacred geography, the biblical anthropology certification will probably be right up somebody's alley, because it deals, there's a whole course module in that certification program that deals with geography, biblical geography.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much, brother. I appreciate you taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Gonna change my ways.